Welcome to Fortress on a Hill. I'm Henry.
I'm Danny.
I'm Kagan.
We're three leftist veterans that aim to expose the reality of the U.S. military's multiple wars abroad and to illuminate the damage military service does to Americans.
American presidents throughout U.S. history have used American military and diplomatic power to force regime change of democratically elected governments around the world.
Most veterans come from families vested in prior service, and American generals choose their own, ensuring diversity of thought never interferes with American warmongering.
How can we stand by and do nothing while our military kills and destroys lives the world over, while telling Americans that all this death and destruction protects them from terrorists when nothing could be more false?
Fortress on a Hill aims to change that.
Good morning, listeners. Welcome to a new episode of Fortress on a Hill. We're here today with Pam Campos Palma. I hope I pronounced that correctly. Who is going to discuss with us the case, the investigation, the reality of the murder of Vanessa Guillen. It's a hard subject, but we need to try to find some truth in all of this bullshit. So, Pam, welcome. Thank you for being with us today.
You said it perfectly, and I'm happy to be here.
Good. I'm glad.
Yeah.
One of my pet peeves is saying people's names wrong.
Yeah. No worries.
Okay, so to start off, I want to give some details about the case, just so everybody can have a little bit of familiarity if they haven't been reading about it. In late April of this year, Vanessa Guillen's unit declared her missing, and they said that she was supposed to have gone from her arms room where she worked as an Army armorer, somebody who works on weapons, on machine guns and stuff, to a different arms room for a different company, but in the same overall unit. I mean, not the company, but the battalion, brigade, in the big unit sense. And then no one saw her again after that. She was supposed to show up at the motor pool to provide some serial numbers for the stuff that she was working on, and she just did not show up. The biggest thing I'd like to point out from that time is that she left personal items of hers, to include her wallet and her barracks room key, in the arms room. That's essentially leaving the key to her house, just leaving it behind. And it's curious why they didn't attempt to do something about that at the time. There also was no interview conducted immediately with whom we believe to be the killer, a specialist Robinson, but he should have been interviewed then as the person who last saw Vanessa. Even if she happened to disappear in a way that wasn't connected to Robinson, his statement, an interview of him would have been very valuable, and it didn't happen right away. I think it happened 6 or 7 days later. We then move over to mid-May. There was huge delays in trying to find out information. That's been a big ongoing issue with Vanessa's family, trying to question CID, the FBI, Vanessa's chain of command about what's happening, and receiving very little, if any, useful information. In mid-May, it came out that there were 2 witnesses to seeing Specialist Robinson carry a tough box from where he worked in his arms room out to his personal vehicle. They said that the box was very heavy, but that information didn't come out until mid-May. And it's something I plan to poke at a little bit later, but just for everybody going in. We then move a little bit further towards the end of May, beginning of June, where cell phone records requested by CID and the FBI pinged Robinson and his girlfriend at a place outside Fort Hood, near the Leon River in Texas, and ultimately that was where her remains were found. And then lastly, once it was cleared, once her remains were actually discovered, once they actually knew what they were dealing with, Specialist Robinson got confined to his barracks. He then ran away from the barracks, snuck past whatever people were guarding him, and then when confronted by local law enforcement out in Killeen, outside of Fort Hood, he killed himself. There's a lot of other information about the case, so listeners, if you're looking for more of the standard kind of stuff, that's not really what we're going to be discussing today. The mainstream media coverage of this has been very very stereotypical. Not asking many questions, not pointing out crucial things that needed to be noted about what happened to Vanessa and how the investigation has moved forward. Pam, I'd like to give you first dibs at this. Can you tell the listeners your impressions of what happened to Vanessa and the larger systemic issues that are involved in that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I'll start off by saying that I think the realm of this issue, military, the systemic issues of military sexual violence, corruption with impunity. I mean, these are repeatedly, for me as an organizer in this field, this is one of the hardest realms to work in, because one, it's so pervasive, but there's such a dichotomy between, many of us who served, this is not a surprise. Another, case is just one in the pan of so many, over so many decades. But there's a clear rift where, with this case, there was a few things that were different, I think. Vanessa Guillen's family, of Mexican descent, an immigrant family, was very loud from the second that she was disappeared, and was very clear. Vanessa Guillen's mother, Gloria Guillen, has been clear, and the most clear throughout months, around the fact that her daughter told her that she was being sexually harassed by a superior. And one thing that caught my eye very early on was that this was really lost, because Gloria Guillen was only doing Spanish media interviews because she only speaks Spanish. It has become now common knowledge that, like so many of us, Vanessa Guillen enlisted in the Army to be able to grant her family citizenship. And so it's the same story. You just kind of see the same story for many of us, where the military is an outlet for upward mobility. There's corruption and impunity. And she's, the hashtag I am Vanessa Guillen took off, because I think we are in a reckoning moment in this country, tired of the hypocrisies, tired of the injustices, and thousands on thousands of survivors from military sexual crimes rang out and said no more, right? In a way that was also different. Another thing that Gloria Guillen did that was different is she did not treat DOD, generals, commanders with the blind allegiance and respectability politics that we usually see. In fact, she has said the opposite. And increasingly, she has been very candid and open about the oppressive engagements, the racism. Most recently in DC, she said CID is lying and they are the criminals. And so I think that there have been decades of missing and murdered, definitely women, but I think as we've seen with the cases coming out of Fort Hood, this has been pervasive. And, a good reminder, and the thing that I find so astonishing, is that Fort Hood is among the largest and most resourced Army installations in the United States. So one would think, and the biggest question that came up from the very beginning is, how does a soldier go missing off of one of the most secure places, supposedly, on the face of the earth, right? And to that end, there are now 23 by the Fort Hood's, and this is where I think this conversation is so important, by Fort Hood officials' own account, there have been 23 dead soldiers in and around Fort Hood this year alone, right? Frankly, many of us have lost count of the accounts of deaths, and several of them are classified as suicides or accidents. But the big question remains, if the Department of Defense continues to investigate itself, if Congress doesn't ask any real questions and is very comfortable with that system, how are we to know that they are not concealing criminality by their own hand? And, many of us believe that the typical mechanisms and tropes of scapegoating, junior enlisted, scapegoating, just soldiers that don't know any better. This is just an occupational hazard. These are all mechanisms to avoid actual accountability and consequence from the people at the top who have allowed this to be commonplace within our armed services. And the last thing I'll say is that the attention on Vanessa Guillen has been really critical, not only on systemic changes, right? The fact of the matter is systemic racism and sexual violence is par for the course in military culture. It is a training tool from the second you step on basic training footsteps all the way to through the VA and even to people's untimely or timely death. And so this is a bigger problem that we must tackle. And the thing that is most glaring is, why is it that those people that should be accountable to the troops, the hypocrisy of we support the troops so much, have done little to nothing for decades, right? Zero tolerance has actually not meant zero tolerance. It has meant cover-ups and impunity.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I hate to get this wrong, but they found another soldier's body during the search. Another missing soldier, I believe. Like not related at all to the case, is what I believe I read, because there's so many folks missing that we don't have accountability. And you make a really important point about this. There's like a mythology about the military as I see it. Some of it's film, some of it's politics, some of it's pretty nefarious. The military is the most organized institution. If you want, and competent at everything. If you want a problem solved, give it to the military, no matter what it is, right? If we needed to fix kindergarten teaching around America, there's a significant portion of this country that would say, send in the military, they'll do it. But yet in reality, Fort Hood, this, I believe, the second largest military installation in the Americas, is missing all these soldiers, and the culture that you're mentioning of race and patriarchy and just sexual violence. And it's, in reality, what you have is an off-the-rails institution that is given sort of adulation that's beyond what it deserves. And I would ask you, this case has brought up, as you mentioned, issues that have existed for so long and gotten them into the public eye again, and maybe even more than previously. What do you think the context, right, time, like temporal, and also just her individual case, what is it that is bringing this to the fore now, finally, more, not perfectly, not enough, but what's the kind of perfect storm that we're seeing, if you could put your finger on it?
Yeah. I mean, I think that we're in a crisis. I know we all have seen for a while that this country is in a crisis of legitimacy and identity. And especially in this year of a hurricane of crises, right? Like, we have a front row seat, right, to the deep corruption, the hypocrisies, the contradictions, right, of living in a pandemic, but the government can't do, or refuses to do little about it. The political, willful ignorance around some of the most dastardly, systemic issues in our society, whether that's state violence, whether that's the killing of Black men in the streets by, and rampant state violence, or the fact that even if you serve in uniform as a brown person in America, it will not protect you. You are not protected. And so one thing that I think is really key that I've seen in my organizing throughout with this case in particular is the enormous hypocrisy of what does service actually mean in America, right? Because if you can't even keep troops safe, which there's this whole conversation around, like, are troops more special and more sacred than any other living person, in our country. But if you can't even do that, with the tropes and the hypocrisies of we love the troops, we're going to throw them in these endless wars, not serve them, and then keep them on these criminal, decrepit bases with no accountability, I think that we have reached a fever pitch in this country. And I think that it is not an accident that the particularly Latino, Latinx community has been out in droves. And the sentiments that I have heard most is we want to serve this country, but it will not let us, whether that's in the military, whether that's as immigrants. And so there's something deeper with the Guillen case around this really terrible rupture moment. I also think that we're in a moment where we are seeing a breakdown in politicians. I mean, it's Congress's job to have oversight of the military. And they, even with the glaring gaps in the Guillen case, there's been lots of them who say, well, we're waiting on the Army to self-investigate. Literally when the Army is not giving them, when anybody off the street can tell you that there's a cover-up, obviously, in the mix here. And then I think lastly is, and I'm losing my train of thought a little bit. Sorry, it's been a heavy few months of this case and this organizing. But I would say that lastly, I've never seen survivors take their power back like this before. And one thing that has been different has been, predominantly women have been ripping their wounds open and telling their, we carry trauma in suitcases and then whip them out for people to give a shit around the exploitation, killings and death and abuse of soldiers and troops and everyday working people. And finally, I think we're at a moment where lots of people said, no more. I'm not going to relitigate with you if rape culture is military culture. It is. And your precious institution, right? Like there is a divide, I think, between those in the community, the military community who, frankly, profit. And, the valor parts of it is profitable and really is a great meal ticket. And there's a tension, I think, in the community around how dare you criticize the military. And then survivors, people of color, women, the Guillen family for sure, saying, actually, it is the greatest betrayal to just have rose-colored glasses and not call the question on the corruption of an institution that we know is the most trusted institution in American society. This is irresponsible, and we must, end and radically transform. So there's probably other things I'm missing, but that comes to mind.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Oni, just to jump in on that. Some of the things that you said really just resonated. This question that we could probably do a whole pod on, and we won't go too far on, of like whether soldier lives matter more, and I think that's problematic, right? Same thing with like police lives. There's this idea that because there's bagpipes at the ceremony and the sound of taps is haunting, that somehow, when a uniformed member of society, any paramilitary, that they're somehow more valuable. But even if we leave aside the problematic nature of, emphasizing one life's value over another, I think you point out the hypocrisy here of we all adulate the soldiers and the politicians and the media and the people who profit off of it emphasize like how much, almost with a degree of almost insecurity. It's like they're making this a salve to like make themselves feel better somehow. Like they have to constantly laud the soldiers until it's hard, right? Or until it's inconvenient, until it goes against the political narrative. And so, yeah, we love soldiers, but endless war is fine. We love soldiers, but rampant sexual abuse and assault across our military, including at our sacred cow military academies. And then we lie about it. And then there's no accountability for the stat fudging that went on there, even when I was teaching there. And so I think, we adulate, it seems, and I think this is one of the things I'm hearing from you that's most interesting. It's like we adulate the myth of the military rather than its reality. So the surface idea that it's just heroic and it's just a big, walking American flag and everyone's equal and there's no color in the military because everyone knows that, the military is the most unifying institution and it's perfect. We adulate the myth, and then when like the dirty side and the real side and the underbelly is emphasized, it's funny how people polarize, and a lot of the most patriotic pro-troops folks will sort of attack the character of people and victim blame and just, say, oh, how dare you make this a political football? Yeah, that's just me pontificating, but I think that's, the things you're saying they're so important and they're not said enough.
I mean, the other thing I would add is, I mean, this is a little bit also nerdy, but I think a lot about who's allowed to be fully, who's fully included, right? Vanessa Guillen's mother, the words keep ringing in my ears because it's the same thing my mother has said. My mother is the one who encouraged me to enlist because she wanted me to have college money and upward mobility. And Vanessa Guillen's mother, Gloria, said, I gave this country the most precious thing. I gave, my daughter. And I think that, I think a lot about how women, people of color, queer and trans people, children of immigrants, first generation people in the military. I myself have experienced that it's actually never enough. You will always be questioned and undermined. Where are your true, loyalties? Who are you actually allegiant to? Are you actually one of us? And it is this dynamic of American identity. Really importantly, I have found it fascinating, but not surprising, how the Guillen case, whether it's a congressional hearing or in the news, the narrative is, this Black soldier is at fault. It's just junior enlisted people who don't know any better. It's just junior enlisted people that, can't get it together. And there's a deep classism and racism and xenophobia that will always and consistently rely on the other as the scapegoat for the military's problems. Because from the inception, we were never supposed to be part of the institution. We are just tools, right, in the machine. And so it's been really interesting, and I'm really actually curious to hear what you have to say, because what I find so fascinating is that the rot is at the top, right? This is all distraction by design to make us forget that, there have been people that have served for decades in higher ranking power positions that there's no way you don't know that this is, not a problem. I think one of the colonels was asked in a hearing, have you looked at any of the Vanessa Guillen stories, the survivor stories online? And his answer was, I'm not on social media. And so it's fascinating to me, the deference that high-level commanders and generals are given when you would think, have supposedly the most authority and power to actually change the system.
Well, yeah, one last thing just to respond to what you're asking, because you're provoking a lot of thoughts that are super important. The military, like often other paramilitary organizations such as the police, are like the biggest crybabies ever. They say we're snowflakes, but if you question their heroism, competence, or even just mythology, it's like they get really defensive. It's fascinating. But the generals do this, where and all officers and commanders, they take so much pride that they are judge, jury, defense, prosecutor, in the administrative and even to some extent legal system within the military, this commander-driven thing. They take so much pride in that and how much power they have. They brag to each other. The great thing about the military is I can handle problems myself, We say that. I was a commander. I mean, I know these people. And yet, even a general officer, watch how quick, when it's ugly, they wash their hands of it and say well, I don't know, I don't control that. It's just they have it both ways. But what you mentioned about whether you truly belong and the way the culture operates, unspoken, but also sometimes spoken, this idea of who's truly an American soldier. And I did find, and I don't love every aspect of how I felt over the course of 20 years involved with the military in one way or the other, but I do know now, and I think I knew then, that there was a sense that the truest of true soldiers, the real soldier, is a white male infantryman, scout, tanker, right? And that was there. And so I'll just give you an example of what I mean. My own, and I mean, this is confession time, not cool, don't like it, hate myself for this. I didn't speak up enough when I was a cadet about just the terrible pejoratives that were thrown around and the the subculture among the male cadets of the female cadets are like problematic, and there was like all these slangs that were thrown around about them. Oh, they're not attractive enough, or they're not as like, oh, they have such easy standards, you know. And I was never like a loud guy about that kind of stuff, but I kind of like let it happen, you know, just awful, just that kind of enabling. And I think that like to some degree below the surface, because I had said to myself like, well, I'm going to go do like combat arms stuff and, you know, go, you know, martyr myself for nothing. You know, I'm not going to worry about like interaction with like the female cadets. I was always polite. I was always nice. I was never like a mean guy, but I just didn't like make an effort really to like understand or make a whole lot of friends among the female cadets. And then I go out into the Army where I don't really serve with females because, you know, just the type of units I was in at the time, especially. But I'll tell you what was a big change for me. I came back to teach at the academy in 2014, and I was like, it was like I was blown away, you know, because like I really, for the first time, like truly connected with my female cadets and like talked to them offline and tried to understand and realizing what was going on, and like this enormous value that is brought to the military by all these different ways of thinking and types and diversities. And like, I don't know, because I'd been out in the wars and seen us fail with the old method, and that's not the good reason. That's not the main reason. There's an ethics to it. But even just from like a practical reason, like seeing like the white male old militarism just smash against complex societies and fail, I was like, oh my God, I got this all wrong. And then of course, watching the sexual assault cases in some instances, several instances, my own students, and following it and watching the fails, it really changed how I view it. And the reason I even tell this story is probably partly like Catholic penance, but also this notion that if we're honest with ourselves, I think a lot of like officers, enlisted guys, combat arms, all kinds of people will say there is a subculture that you don't really belong unless you're this mythologized version of a soldier. And that's a long answer to your question or statement, but I think it's super important that we're self-aware about what's really going on. Because if we don't say it and we don't admit it, then like, what's the point? We're never going to get forward at all.
Mm-hmm. And beyond, you know, my thought is beyond the consciousness, because this consciousness is contrary to the ethos, right? To what you said. In my experience, when it's raised, like one of the most politicizing experiences I had in the military was I found it very interesting how explicit racism and xenophobia. You know, I served as an intel analyst, you know, sitting around all day watching the news. Fox News is on. And I had the experience often where working with, you know, security forces, the dehumanizing language of talking about people. And even in the times where like I was part of the whole hearts and minds, you know, pivot and whatever. And it was glaring to me how when we were talking about immigrants and, local nationals, et cetera, it was deeply jingoistic, racist, like the ethno-nationalist almost language. And what was politicizing to me was, I remember very clearly, some conversation erupted in the office around diversity. And I think I said something pretty simple around like, I believe in equity and diversity and like, you know, women. And I was reprimanded for being too political. And so there is, I think, a warped sense of what is, you know, commonplace and like, what is the actual culture of the military, right? If you treat women as they are intruders, as they are liabilities, right? I hear countless stories from women who served that, you know, when they were in a hot situation on a deployment, men around them were just like, yeah, I'm not going to have your back because you can't have mine. Like, right. So like, this is deep. And I think it is so entangled in the institution's makeup that my question is consistently like, whose job is it to unfuck it? Whose job is it to like stop letting this incredible, like forceful machine that has caused so much destruction? Where does the buck stop in terms of like, oh yeah, you know, soldiers going missing and dead at an exorbitant rate, rapes and murders. And, you know, and we're just talking, the other thing that I think about a lot is we're just talking about people in uniform, right? Like the Fort Hood deaths and missing soldiers, we're talking about soldiers. And we all know we all know, those of us that serve, that soldiers don't stay on base all the time. They go off base, they go on college campuses. If you're on a deployed location, civilians are in the mix. So there's even a broader, damage pool that I think about a lot. And to me, the constant question is, Department of Defense defending what? And whose job is it to course correct this mission? And is it even a redeemable institution? So I think that this moment, and the Guillen case in particular, has kicked up a lot of questions, because the other thing I'll remind is that Gloria Guillen, the mother, her demands are clear. Shut down Fort Hood. She has said, we will not enlist our children if you don't get your shit together, and if you don't get justice for my daughter, and if you don't fix the entire system. And she has, understandably said, arrest these people. I think a lot about these commanders are still just hanging out on Fort Hood, going to PT. I mean, I think a lot about, back to, adulation of troops. I don't understand in what rational mind you can love the troops and be completely complicit and complacent about the normalcy of our abuse and killings, whether in wars abroad or here on bases.
Henry, we've talked I've talked to the officers and commander side a little bit, but in response to what Pam is saying, what jumps out at you both from the NCO position and the military police position, but also just your values, what's jumping at how because I think we all see these things differently and maybe have different answers to this question.
My time in the Army, I served alongside with female MPs, and I consider them to be my sisters. I didn't see them as weaker than me or less than me. They were right there doing the same things I was doing. For me, it was not even a question. But what I saw other men do, other NCOs, it was just abhorrent. That young, junior enlisted females would be harassed or thought of as far less than a male soldier at almost any turn. It didn't take a lot to have that happen. And also there, especially for the MP Corps, there is on the small side, but a strong core of female NCOs and officers. And I remember a first sergeant, I think I just had a ceremony for Soldier of the Month, and apparently we were standing around, getting a Friday safety brief or something else, and she screamed out at everybody, "Okay, who was the person that turned me into crap, I'm blanking on the name. I was going to say Internal Affairs, but the Army doesn't have that. It might have been Equal Opportunity, but I can't remember exactly who the agency was. But anyways, so she screams that in front of all whatever 130, 140 of us, that someone had the gall to make a complaint somehow related to her, and they were just a fucking coward. That there was no way to see around it. I also saw women being harassed. My ex-wife, told me horrible stories about how she was treated by a specific NCO, and I, as her partner, I wanted to go beat the absolute shit out of the guy, but that was not my fight to have. But it was very hard to see her in so much pain from that, and from wondering what the Army's social circles, how they're going to treat her now. She was working at the local MP station, and their little crews there, they're the ones that run the radios and take 911 calls and stuff like that. They're very, very insular. No different than infantry squads or Cap Scouts or other things like that. But it was clear that there was two sets of rules, or maybe even more, that you know, the men could immediately say, you know, this woman is nothing, she's not a good soldier, she's a bitch or a slut, and immediately it changes the whole demeanor of how she's treated. You know, we live as units, we deploy as units, and those things aren't forgotten. And soldiers want to move up. They don't want to create problems. They don't want to create waves. But mainly is that they don't see this problem as them not standing up for fellow soldiers. They are able to detach themselves far enough from it that it's not their problem. And it very much is their problem. It's their problem to protect people. That NCOs are tasked with two things: the accomplishment of the mission and welfare of the soldiers. And sometimes the mission, sometimes number one, is indeed number two. Taking care of soldiers is the mission. And this is a case, like many others, where that absolutely has not happened. The guys and I love doing the podcast. Being able to share our experiences in the military with allies and supporters means the world to us. But we can't do all the work. We need you to share an episode of ours with someone, anyone whom you might think might be affected by it. Young people looking to join the military, or parents advocating for one, conscientious citizens who care about the violence the U.S. wages in their name, advocates for women and people of color who understand the harsh environment the military creates for females and minorities and inflicts on minorities around the globe, and anyone else you think it might affect. Please take a moment, pause the episode, share this with them. Now, our podcast is supported in a few different ways. First, there's Patreon, where we're blessed to have an array of wonderful supporters helping the guys and I pay for some of the podcast's expenses. Those who contribute $10 a month or more will be mentioned right here as an honorary producer, helping keep you, our listeners, stocked with new episodes. But you don't have to contribute $10 a month to help us. For as little as $1 a month, you can keep us going, paying for hosting and storage fees, transcribing old and new episodes, promoting and expanding the podcast, and more I'm sure I can't think of at the moment. So, let's bring out these honorary producers, and they are Will Arenz, Fahim Shirazi, James O'Barr, Adam Bellows, Eric Phillips, Paul Appel, Julie Dupree, Thomas Benson, Emma P., Janet Hansen, Lawrence Taylor, Tristan Oliver, Marwan, and the Status Quo podcast. Your contributions are wonderfully helpful to us. Thank you so much. However, if Patreon isn't your style, you can always contribute directly to us through PayPal at paypal.me/ForSaunaHill. Or please check out our store on Spreadshirt.com. Make sure you check for promo codes before you order. And now, let's get back to the podcast.
Yeah, 100%. I think also, I agree.
Inspector General, that's what I meant. Sorry.
Right, IG, yeah. Well, I mean, I 100% agree that if we're going to have a commanders-driven system, which I don't think we should, by the way, on certain cases, which we'll get to, but if we're going to have it, then you have to own it. And we've all seen, right, all three of us, I know, have seen how fast a unit can turn on a dime and accomplish a mission when it's important, or when they think it's important, or they think their boss thinks it's important, right? I mean, stamp out, cold, just make it happen. Nobody sleeps, right? We do this for the most mundane things, like a PowerPoint briefing that gets scheduled at the last second. And we've done it for big issues too, and I mean imperfectly, but I mean, just one example. Don't Ask, Don't Tell was getting ready to go away while I was in command. And, the five of us would have lunch together like once a week, and, I was the communist and they were real Americans, and we would argue all the time, but we were buddies, right? We drank beers together. We got along just fine. And we would argue about gays in the military all the time. And that has obviously been completely imperfect, and it's not like a perfect transition. But they argued to me throughout that year, this is going to take the military down. If it's the same arguments that were made about letting women in, about letting African Americans in. Like, it's going to destroy camaraderie, but this will be even worse because it's not just race or gender. It's like the sexuality. And so somehow it's going to destroy morale. Actually, we're going to lose the war on terror, which has already been lost, by doing this. Like, this was essentially how far the argument would go. And I would always say the same thing. I would say, I will bet you everything that I have that this is going to go off, not without a hitch in terms of it's I'm sure, an incredibly difficult experience still, of course, to be, gay, trans, anything in the military. So I'm not taking away from that. But in terms of the fact that it will happen, units will still accomplish their missions, I said, this is going to go off without a hitch. This is going to be, nothing's going to, it's going to be fine. And they were like, yeah, right. And of course, time and again, if you have to do something, or you think you do, or commanders make it a priority, it can happen. So we're not deploying hundreds of thousands of soldiers overseas anymore. Not that would be an excuse. There is the ability to make this the priority. If the general officers wanted it to be, if the civilian officials of the Pentagon wanted it to be, and if individual captains, lieutenants, and sergeants wanted it to be, it could be. But of course, I think the caveat, and then I'll let us let Pam transition us, or you, Henry, but the caveat is, of course, that I do think that the commander-driven system for much of this is inherently flawed and has failed, right? And therefore, so I'm not lauding that system, which I think is worth talking about, and I think needs to go in certain cases, and is archaic, by the way, and undemocratic, and a whole bunch of problematic things. But it's and maybe unconstitutional. But it's, if we're going to have that system, then we need to own it, and it's on officers, non-commissioned officers, and certainly general officers to make it a priority. But they really don't, except saying the right thing and putting a blurb on a PowerPoint slide most of the time.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it comes back down to, I've been thinking a lot about military culture and how for us, sayings and different sayings, I think about them now and I'm like, why did I not think that was fucked up, And the one that comes up for me is shut up in color. Shut up in color. It's one of the things I heard most in the military. And I think a lot about, to your point, what would be required is that whistleblowing and critical thinking not be punished in service. But as we all know, I'll speak for myself as, someone who left as an NCO. I also went up for a commission twice. And I was told, at the very end of my career, I went up for a commission. It was between myself and another colleague, a white man. And both of us were asked by this all-male board the question, when you become a commissioned officer of the Air Force, what would be your top systematic, policy priority, which is a weird question. And he said, I would make sure that physical fitness standards would be more rigorously met. And I said, I would work to eradicate sexual harassment and assault in the Air Force. Mind you, we had just had a couple of pilots looking at porn in the tactics room. So that felt like a timely answer. And instead what happened was I was pulled aside. They asked a female intel colonel to pull me aside and asked me if I was okay and treat me with suspicion. And, goes to say, I did not get the commission. And so one of my biggest lessons learned from the military, and when I was enlisted active duty, I also filed an IG complaint. And I often joke that I started organizing in the military. But, the military is exceptional hierarchy, the power dynamics. I keep having to remind people, this isn't a regular workplace. You don't have rights. And so even when I see, whether it's a lowly, officer or NCO trying to protect their troops, or even like Captain Crozier, right, on the Roosevelt, trying to protect his people, there is, I believe, a mandate of punishment for anyone that dissents or speaks out or does try to do the right thing. And I think that as an institution, we're lost, because one thing that I keep thinking about and can't forget is that our current highest ranking officer in the Department of Defense, Mark Milley, was the former commander of Fort Hood at the height of its criminality, at the height of its sexual assaults and deaths, right? When there was a mass shooting on that base. But that's the guy that we decided was going to be the best person for that job. So there's a part of me that thinks that there is never an opportunity. Like, can senior officers ever do wrong? And my answer is no. The entire system is set up to protect them because our mandate is difficult. Like, the military has a very specific job to do, and we haven't reconciled, I think, as a society around the deep failures of how that continues to make everyday soldiers, who are largely working people, whether you're an officer or lowly enlisted, right? You're not being paid. I know that there's these jokes about, like, the young E3 who, like, goes and gets, a big car. But, like, these are people are being paid poverty wages to take abuse. And I think a lot about the labor economics of the dynamics in the military.
And also included with that is the lack of, or at least scarce, environmental regulations that allow things like the PFAS contamination of so many bases around the country. And it should be an outrage. It should be something that people are up in arms about greatly. How could our wonderful troops get poisoned while they're trying to protect America? But it's not seen that way. It doesn't, the mythos crushes those kinds of ideas. So I'd like to turn a little bit to the law enforcement perspective on this, and these are just thoughts and ideas I've had since researching about what happened to Vanessa and the larger systemic issues around military sexual trauma. I want to point a couple things out before I first get into it. First, I'm presuming that both Vanessa's chain of command and the Fort Hood CID or the MPs there believed that she was truly AWOL, not missing or in danger of some kind. Now, I'm not saying that that's an acceptable decision. I flat out refute that notion at all. But if that is the logic, then some of their steps can seem, if not acceptable, a tiny bit more understandable. And following that idea, if she was truly seen as AWOL, that means that this CID and the MPs failed to do a proper initial investigation in and near the sites where she was last seen, including canvassing, doing field interviews, asking everybody what they saw, where they worked that day, all those kind of basic things to give the investigators a picture. That also means that the focus of the investigation never pointed to the subject, Specialist Robinson, until the phone records requested by law enforcement placed him and his girlfriend near the Leon River, where Vanessa's remains were found. And these, like I said, these initial statements, initial interviews are so paramount to an investigation because they create the parameters for how they're going to move forward, looking through statements for names of people to interview, dates, times, and just while I'm thinking about it, the surveillance conditions on most military bases. I remember working a murder case in 2006 with CID. I was on the drug team, but it was kind of all hands on deck. And one of my jobs was to go to the MP station and sit in front of their computer that managed all of the camera feeds for the post. And I don't know exactly who or what circumstances made it so they said that military posts have poor surveillance or they're not able to pull the tapes or anything like that, but they should. And if they don't, if Fort Hood doesn't, because I was at Fort Lewis for 6 years, and like I said, this kind of stuff was tracked. So moving on to a little more specifics here, Why didn't her leaving her personal items behind in the arms room strike a bell with anyone, whether law enforcement or in her chain of command? What did her actual squad leader, section leader, sergeant in charge of her actually do when he found out that she was missing? I'm assuming it's a he, but it could be a female as well. Did any investigator, did any MP actually sit with all these people when she vanished and asked those questions? So you have that the NCO, whoever it was, NCO or officer who called the MPs. You have the armorer, the subject of the investigation, the person who we believe killed her, who told everybody that she left behind her wallet and her room key, which are ordinary human things that we don't leave behind. When you live in the barracks, sometimes the only thing you carry around with you, other than maybe your wallet, is your barracks room key. It's your house. It's where you live. Why in the world would it be randomly left behind if that person went on AWOL? Did any of these NCOs or officers physically go to the arms room where she was last seen to get Vanessa's personal effects or check the arms room to ensure all was well? At this point, and this is a bit morbid, but I think it's very important, it was a crime scene and must have had the strong smell of blood, which is, despite all the many odors of a small confined room filled with guns and tools to fix guns, the smell of blood would have been noticeable, if not unavoidable, as would have been the visual evidence of her death. And talking about the arms room for a minute, I want to use that as a little bit of a microcosm to describe how female troops live in the military. In the Army, and I assume the Marines and Air Force, everybody else does it pretty similar, arms rooms or armories are usually located in basements or other detached locations. Unless soldiers are drawing weapons for training or maintenance, most of them won't visit these areas as part of the normal jobs. Their seclusion makes them ideal places to harass or corner someone with no one in range to object or even bear witness to how soldiers who work there are treated, unless leaders regularly go down there and check things out. If Vanessa's supervisors had possibly taken more time to visit her actual workspace instead of simply believing everything was okay, her killer would have been forced to be much more cautious with his treatment of her. So we have this failure to do a basic initial investigation. That's my standing on this right now, is they did not do their fucking jobs. They didn't go to the arms room. They didn't conduct subject interview of Robinson as the last person who saw Vanessa. There was significant delays in interviewing vital witnesses, which gave Specialist Robinson and his girlfriend the chance to perfect their alibis for when they finally did have questions that they could not easily answer. The phone records that ultimately sent officers to Vanessa's remains near the Leon River were obtained long after they should have been, especially once Specialist Robinson's girlfriend was shown to be lying in her initial interviews. Then, if it wasn't bad enough, once CID found the actual burn site, which had tough box remains. Hold on one second. A tough box being a large kind of Rubbermaid container, but they're very tough, and we use them to carry equipment, extra uniforms and stuff on deployments, or it can carry whatever. It's just that they're very common in among soldiers. Once CID actually found the burn site, which had remains from the tough box, they should have treated it as an active crime scene. That means that Vanessa's remains were able to deteriorate and the crime scene unsecured for another 9 days before CID actually found them. And finally, they allow a murder subject to remain only confined to his barracks, but otherwise unsupervised. And they may have had a fleet of guys watching him, I don't know, but I would assume it was less than 2 or less, and he was able to sneak away. I'm of the opinion that they should have apprehended him over what CID chose to do, which to do something called a controlled phone call. And it's essentially where 2 people involved in a case contact each other, and on one side, the person doing the calling, the investigators are listening. It's an attempt to get a confession. And I feel like they chose to do that over immediately apprehending him, and he fled and he killed himself. Law enforcement can be super confession hungry, and it goes beyond needing actual proof in a law enforcement investigation. Now, some of this stuff may be cleared up by further investigative work or through FOIA requests, something I'm going to do about this case. The notes that I've compiled here are from an FBI agent's summary of the events through Robinson's death, but the basic timeline makes no sense whatsoever. There are also character questions. Who among Vanessa's unit and COs and officers gave info about Vanessa's character and or was asked about whether her disappearance was something in line with going AWOL? Danny, I know you've experienced this. Troops often do really dumb things, and they also give signs, usually when they're going to do that or they're going to go AWOL. Not always, but sometimes. Both Vanessa's boyfriend and her sister spoke to her the day she disappeared. Where are all these people's written statements being asked those questions? Her mom, her sister, her boyfriend, people that she knew. There should be a stack of them. And I believe we've talked a little bit today about credibility. You know, who in the military gets to decide who is and who isn't seen as credible? Who gets to decide that Vanessa's sexual harassment wasn't real or didn't happen because no one in a uniform corroborated it? Why isn't her family statements given the weight of a soldier or an officer? Now, the UCMJ has provisions that give extra weight to a soldier's ostensibly positive service when they're accused of a crime. Their quote-unquote honorable service stands in solidarity with their defense against criminal charges. Why isn't Vanessa's family and the people close to her given that same level of credibility? I'll let you guys jump in.
Yeah. Well, Pam, you go ahead first.
Yeah. Gloria Guillen gave a speech in DC that has kept me up at night. She's I can't emphasize it enough. The language and justice barriers here are enormous, and she has been very, very clear. She talks about the disrespect that she experienced from Fort Hood officials, from CID, from even Vanessa Guillen's chain of command. And it's very clear to me, as someone who, the government spent a lot of money training on being, analytical. It's very clear to me that this is not just an aggrieved mother, but someone who has a deep understanding of corruption. One thing that I would also point out that I think has gotten really lost is the 3rd Cav Regiment, the 3rd Cavalry Regiment that Vanessa Guillen fell under. If you Google it on the Fort Hood website, the page has been sanitized and scrubbed. Vanessa Guillen's regimental commander, Colonel Ralph Overland, before he was the commander of the 3rd Cav of Vanessa Guillen's chain, he was an executive officer on the Army staff for the current Secretary of the Army, Ryan McCarthy, who was appointed by this administration. And that Secretary of the Army, who ordered a, air quotes, review of Fort Hood's sexual harassment and assault prevention program, they themselves admitted in a congressional hearing that they did not look at Vanessa Guillen's unit. And so these are facts, right? This isn't a conspiracy. These are open source things that anyone can research and look at themselves. And I think what is most glaring to me is that we, as the American public, I believe because of ignorance of the military, but also because of a cultural deference and blind trust, are kind of comfortable with the lack of answers. But more damning and more enraging to me is that politicians, whose literal job it is to oversee this, they who have the power to ask questions have not. So one big question I have is, if I was a sitting congressperson, you better believe that I would have dragged this guy into, a hearing room and questioned him publicly. But it's interesting to me, all of the excuses that are put out, whether it's the pandemic or it's just too hard, or, there's just a litany of excuses that are always made. And you would think that, military leadership responsible with such a high caliber of responsibility would be held to account in a meaningful way. And so again, it didn't take me long to put these pieces together by just doing my due diligence. And I think what keeps us from doing due diligence is a real big comfort with just blindly trusting high-ranking DoD officials and the military.
I think that's a great point. And you said earlier, and I really did mean to respond to it, a system that instead of, for all our talk about mission first, soldiers always, take care of the troops, these platitudes, in my experience, and I think that there is empirical and demonstrable evidence, perhaps anecdotal, but instructive enough, that the system is designed to protect career officers, especially career officers who have connections, right, to the powerful, right? And it's a sycophant system of promotion. The generals choose their own. That's a unique and interesting factor, right? It is a group of generals who choose the next crop of generals, right? Which affects change in a tactical and sort of, visionary strategic sense, but also affects change in terms of culture, which can be more toxic. And so if you look at a lot of these cases, it does seem that follow the careers. And in other words, folks like us who have the inside baseball a little bit know how to do that quickly. You look up the guy's bio, you see what did he do last, and you say, oh, wait, who commanded the thing that he worked in last? And you kind of piece together in, 20 minutes of like a Wikipedia spiral or, a .mil spiral, and you kind of figure out who's protected. And my experience was that in the Army, and you talked about the war on dissent and the war on even asking questions or being skeptical that you saw, and who gets promoted and who doesn't, who gets the commission and who doesn't. I found that incompetence and toxic leadership rarely was the thing that would get you in trouble, fired, or not promoted. Rather, if you look at the things that tend to, in other words, there are colonels, I've worked for one of them, there are colonels and generals out there who got soldiers killed literally for careerist reasons. I mean, obscene stuff, and this is not like fantasy. But those guys, they move on and they lead the next war. And I've seen people who are toxic leaders. I mean, terrible, like kind of racist, definitely chauvinist, or just cruel. But what'll get you in trouble is if you embarrass the military. So if your character flaw, which has been hidden for 25 years, somehow hidden, right, open secret, gets into the news, breaks into the media, or if you start to question the war or the tactics or anything really, or the culture, and you embarrass the military, that's the cardinal sin. That's the cardinal sin. That will end your career. And so it's like we don't focus on the important things. But I think what you're mentioning about this, the colonel in charge and who did he work for, and working for the Secretary of the Army. I mean, these systems are not designed to hold folks accountable. And so it's an inverted system. But why should that surprise us when the military itself looks like America's caste system? And I CASTE, right? It looks like America's caste system sort of on steroids. I mean, in a very public way. I mean, look at like the racial component of officers versus enlisted, of the combat arms versus the non-combat arms, of of class, and I mean, it's like a microscope in a way on American society, except it's like heightened by the mission being so dangerous and public and all this. But yeah, I think that's an important point. And Henry, you had asked about the commander's perspective, and I'll be brief about it because I think we've covered most of it. But I looked at the case, I read it, and just even the open source reporting, all I kept thinking was the officers in her chain of command, and I'll only speak to my own experience, were criminally negligent, and they were criminally immoral in their negligence because I saw no prioritization, I saw no urgency, this was not the most, this human being, soldier, person, citizen under their command being missing was clearly not the top priority for that unit. Now, well, why was that? Well, they grew up, some of it's just, there could have been some bad people, but let's assume the best about everybody. They grew up in a culture where their progression, their success was not going to be judged positively. Like, that was not what was going to be positively reinforced. They probably spent more time getting ready for, USR slides, or in other words, like logistical, mundane, right? The banal of like the military bureaucracy. They probably spent a lot more time on that kind of stuff than this case. And so I found as an officer, and I think it's true for a non-commissioned officer or just a human being, that usually you can tell a lot about a person by like which way they break, like picturing a wave. Like, nothing's binary, nothing's completely a dichotomy, but when something crisis-like happens, when something like this happens, which direction are they going to break in? Are they going to break in the direction of like decency, concern, let's benefit of the doubt, like even if maybe it's possible that she's AWOL, like we have to treat this like it's not, I mean, even if there weren't so much evidence that she wasn't AWOL, which way do you break? And to me, I think my last point is this chain of command did not break in the direction of decency. Instead, they did what the military culture has trained them to do, which is to break in the direction of being company men, right? And that is, people die behind that. And I think that this is a perfect case.
Yeah. I mean, if I could add a few things, I know we're over.
Please.
I mean, the reason that this, so a couple of things. I think for me, one of my biggest, one of the things that the rage motivation that I feel in doing this work is I hear my own experience, but I hear time after time, right? I mean, all of us have different military experiences, but at the core of it, what I hear from a lot of people is I did want to serve something bigger than myself. I did want to serve people, and I was lied to, or I was set up for failure, or I have a complicated experience because it didn't pan out to be able to do that in a meaningful way. And I think I feel energized, frankly, by the reality of countless people across the country, whether, inspired by Gloria Guillen or military vets themselves, who are like, yeah, we're going to organize because you shouldn't take my life in vain. I'm not just government property, right? And like the expendability of people in military uniform is also a sickness of this country, right? So that's something that I think about a lot. The other piece I was going to say is I think every day about how more than ever it is critical for us to, so let me just say two things. One of the things that has also activated predominantly, women veterans and service women to activate, around the Vanessa Guillen issue is where are the veteran service organizations, right? You don't see the Guillen family flanked by, officer associations and, VSOs, traditional VSOs, even some of these, political organizations that claim to really, be doing great by vets. And so one thing that really stands out is how alone this family is, mostly surrounded by other Latinos and people of color, right? And the last thing that I'll say is that I think it's never been more important to activate the dissent muscle within the military and veteran community. We have a commander-in-chief who literally just a few months ago tried to use the military against our own civilians, right? There's no question in my mind that he is trying to consolidate the military as his own. And I think that military and veteran folks, we have a choice to make. We either are going to allow ourselves to remain colonized by this blind allegiance to an institution that, let's be real, like hasn't been the most pristine, hasn't done right by all of us, no matter even the best memories or nostalgia that we might have. And, the tough question around our own sacrifice, or we go along with a pretty corrosive and corrupt trend, right? And so my final thing is Vanessa Guillen is just the canary in the coal mine, because if Congress can't even do their fucking job in actually investigating what is clearly an incident rife of corruption, and a military base that should be shut down, frankly, right? This many, like literally a few days ago, there was another dead soldier found at the same lake that she was found. If Congress can't even keep us safe, and do the right thing here, what makes us think that the sliding authoritarianism and the further corruption of the military that expands beyond just sexual violence is going to be something that can be checked?
100%. When you just said that about where the hell is the American Legion and the VFW and any of these veterans organizations, it actually made my stomach hurt for a second, thinking about that, thinking about who stands up for and with who and who doesn't, and what that says about like a society. And it's gross. It's obscene. And I agree with you about activating this, like the dissent within the military. And there is a tradition. It's always been the minority, but there has always been a tradition of dissent within the military, really important dissent. And like, it really is a time for choosing, I think. And I think that this human tragedy is just one of many, but it's important. And it's like one that we really need to rally around. And like, it is a litmus test for decency in a way. Where are you going to come down? Of course, everybody, but as an officer, as a soldier, as a veteran, where are you on this? And I think we have to watch it. And, I know we're about to close out, and I actually have to run on to another call. As always, that's my birthday, and I've overscheduled. That's fun. But I was thinking about the 3rd Armored Cavalry Regiment, Pam, and what you had said about like the former commanders and stuff and who they worked for. And then I just went on this little spiral on my laptop, and I started thinking about, I remember I was an armor officer, even though I was cav. Mm-hmm. And this, back when the 3rd Armored Cavalry was, before it became a striker unit, it was the top command. The best armor officer in his year group, the guy who was most highly thought of, commanded that unit. And it speaks to, I think, this protection of the officers. And I know I'm digressing a little bit, but I think it's worth noting. I mean, who has commanded the 3rd Armored Cavalry Regiment, the 3rd Cavalry Regiment in the past? I mean, you have heard of some of these names, listeners, like H.R. McMaster, mm-hmm. right? Martin Dempsey. Mm-hmm. I mean, if you are an armor officer and you rise to 4-star general status, you may very likely have commanded the 3rd Cavalry Regiment. And so I think that raises questions about who do we protect, whose lives value, what's more important, a life and a future life, because there will be more. Like you said, there already have been, there will be more, or these like very highly lauded and adulated careers and these climbers, Mm-hmm. I think that's a really important point. With that, I'll turn it over to you guys. And this is such an important conversation. God, I'm glad we did this.
Pam, thank you so much for coming to chat with us about this. Will you please let the listeners know where they can find your work and keep track of what you're up to?
Yeah, sure. I'm on Twitter _Pam Campos. I am excited to lead a project called Vets for the People. So you can find us on social media. And I'm committed. I'm committed with Vets for the People and working with others to shut down Fort Hood. And so I invite anyone listening that wants to get in the fight to reach out, because I think that it is our duty to not just change the cycle, but to do right by this family that needs us so much.
We're on Twitter at Fortress on a Hill, and also at Facebook.com at Fortress on a Hill. You can find our main blog page and our full collection of episodes at www.fortressonahill.com. iTunes, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, Patreon, Spotify. You name it, almost anywhere you listen, we're already waiting for you. And hey, we're always in the market for more Patreon supporters. Please consider becoming a patron at patreon.com. And if you're not into giving us a monthly payment, think about giving us a couple bucks on PayPal. The link is in the show notes. Skepticism is one's best armor. Never forget it. We'll see you next time.
And listen to my song. I hope you'll pay attention. I will not